to not come? Too hard of a pew? Too cold of a room? Too much commitment? You know, we should never want to do anything that would keep somebody from coming and assembling together. And there are some people who seem to almost want to do that. But we do need to ask ourselves, are we asking too little of ourselves? Do we think we're being asked too much? If we consider one of the great fathers of the faith, we might not want to really answer that question. In Genesis chapter 22 and verses 1 and 2, we see God giving one of his most unusual commands to one of his most faithful followers. It said it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, "Now take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and after there offering him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will tell you." Abraham, take your son, the son that you thought you would never have, the son that you love with all your heart, and I want you to go and I want you to sacrifice him to me. And it tells us that the next morning, Abraham got up and he started to do just that. He got up early that morning. I don't know if he slept that night. I don't know if he got up early so he didn't have to tell Sarah what he was doing. But he got up and he took the 3-day journey to the mountain that God had told him to offer his son, his only son, the son that he loved. In verses 9 and 10, it tells us that Abraham built the altar, he arranged the wood, and he bound his son, and he laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. What was he thinking? How could he do that? You know, we would think if we heard a voice from heaven that told us to sacrifice our kids, that the first thing we might do is consult a psychiatrist. Of course, for Abraham, who had talked to God, who had been delivered by God, who had felt the presence of God, he knew the commandment was truly from God. But still, how could he do that? Well, lucky for us, the Hebrew writer tells us exactly how he could do that. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, we read, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, who had received the promise, was offering of his only begotten son. It was to he that whom it was said, 'In Isaac will your descendants will be called.' He considered that God is able to raise him from the dead, which he also considered him back as a type." Actually, 3 things that we can look at here that can tell us why Abraham did what he could do. Why Abraham was willing to go up on that mountain. Why Abraham was willing to pull that knife. And why Abraham was willing to bring it down. The first, it tells us because Abraham recognized what it was. A testing. When he was tested. Now, if you read Genesis 22 in verse 1, in some translations, it will say that God tempted Abraham. And that's not right. That's a bad translation. Because we know that God doesn't do that. James tells us that in James chapter 1, verse 13. "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone." You see, what was happening here was not a temptation, but a testing. It was to see the extent of what Abraham believed. You know, there are a lot of times when in our minds we can convince ourselves that we think something. But when it really gets down to it, that's when we truly know, right? When we've been put to the test. Everybody thinks they're going to win until it's time to play the game. And Abram was going under a testing. Later, James would say in James chapter 2 and verse 21 and 29, "Was not our Abraham, our father, purified by his works when he offered Isaac up as a son on the altar? You see that his faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected." Faith isn't what it needs to be until it's tested, until it gets difficult, until it actually means something. And for Abraham, he knew that this was a time of testing. But he also had a thought. Notice what it said back in Hebrews. It said he considered. He considered that God is able to raise the dead. The word there is a word that is a dual word. It has the word, it's logo omaiase, which logos, is a word that we should be familiar with. It's the name John attributes to Jesus. It means word. For the Greeks, it meant this idea of knowledge, of thought. But here it also adds a suffix to it that talks about the process of it. It's the same word that we get logical from today. It was that logical conclusion. And for Abraham, he looked at this situation and he said, if God is asking me to sacrifice my son, it's only because he could bring my son back from the dead. And that's because he promised me that through this son, I would have an inheritance. I would have a promise. So he asked himself, I know what God is. I know what God can do. And I've come to the conclusion that God can bring back the dead. Now this conclusion was based on fact, experience. Because God had done it before with Abraham. And he said, now when had God done that before with Abraham? He had done it with the very creation of Isaac. In Romans chapter 4 and verses 18 through 21, it says that Abraham believed in hope against hope, that he might become the father of a nation according to what was spoken, so shall be your descendants. Without becoming weak in the faith, he contemplated his own body, which was now as good as dead when he was 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet in respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith. He had seen his own body and said, it's dead. There's no way that I can have children. I am past that time. It is over. Yet God provided him a son in that old age. He had seen God bring forth life in death before. And now he was putting his faith and trust that God could do it again. But notice our text also said he did this as a type. And when I said earlier, how could he do that? We were thinking about Abraham, right? But you could also ask that same question of God. How could God do that to Abraham? How could God ask that of Abraham? How God could require that of Abraham? Later on, God would say he never even considered this, right? When there were those who were sacrificing their children, he said, I never wanted that. So how can God then say he did this? Well, it was because he was setting something up. A type means a foreshadowing. And in the Bible, there are lots of types. And types are things that happened in the past that foretell something that is coming. It's an event in the Old Testament. It's something that's done in the Old Law that brings forth fruition in the New. It sets an example. It shows us a pattern. You see, in the very language of the passage, we see this type. What did God ask him to do? To give his one and only son, his only begotten son. He took a 3-day journey for the sacrifice. He was bound to the wood. He was offered as a living sacrifice. Does that sound familiar? John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave what? His only begotten son. In Romans 8, in chapter 30, verse 32, he did not spare his own son. Romans chapter 8, verse 3, he did by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh as an offering for sin. What was God doing with Abraham? He was setting up a story, wasn't he? He was creating a type. There's probably no one who understands more what God was going through than Abraham. You know what it was like as he walked up that mountain to be sacrificed. He knew what it was like to bind his son to the wood. He knew the thoughts and the feelings that when you took this son who had done nothing wrong and now he was going to die. Abraham understood what God was going to have to go through because he was a type. He was done for his testing. He's done for his thought. But he also was done as a type. That's why Abraham was able to do what he did. Here, Abraham was willing to lay everything on the altar. But what about us? Abraham was willing to give it all. But what about us? Because, in a sense, we also have a testing. Right? James 1:3, he talks about the testing of your faith. This morning, we looked at Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 that tells us to present our bodies what? As a living sacrifice. God's asked us to give a sacrifice. The sacrifice of ourselves. And it is also a testing. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. We are a priesthood that is to offer a sacrifice. The sacrifice of self. Are we willing to lay that on the altar? What kind of priest are we? In the book of Malachi, God is arguing with his people. A people who for the outward appearance looked like that they were very godly and very religious, but God was seeing something very different in them. He had seen them become melancholy in their faith. He had seen them become lackluster in their sacrifice. He had seen their commitment wane. And in that book, in Malachi chapter 2 and verses 1 and 2, he looks at the priest. And he said, those sacrifices that you're offering, that you're doing so haphazardly. He said, and now this commandment is for you, O priest. If you do not listen, if you do not take to heart to give honor to my name. He said, I will send a curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Indeed, I have cursed them already. Why? Because you have not taken it to heart. Are we priests who haven't taken it to heart? When it comes to our testing, when it comes to our faith, when it comes to that sacrifice we're obligated to give, are we failing that test because we're not giving it all? What about our thoughts? What are we considering? Or are we even considering at all? When we go to the altar, what is our consideration? Abraham considered and trusted in God. I know what God is able to do. I have heard what he has done. I have seen what he has done, and I want to put my trust in him. But what do we consider? I think about this when we talk about the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. There he tells us in verse 28, a man must examine himself before he eats the bread and drinks the cup. He must take a thought to himself. But how often is it for us a mindless activity, just something that we go through, that we never give much thought to? We may say a passing remark. We may take a casual a thought of it. But really, do we consider what God has done and who he is? Or is our worship just become a mindless activity? When we go to the altar, are we really giving homage to his name? That's what was happening in the book of Malachi. They were profaning the table of God, Malachi chapter 1, verses 12 through 13. And they didn't even recognize it. They didn't even see how they were doing it. They said, how will you do that? And you say, because you say how tiresome it is, how disdainfully you sniff at it. He looked at their offering, you look at what they did, and he said, you don't even seem to put much effort or care into it. Do we make the same mistake? What's our consideration? Do we consider what God has done for us? Do we consider the sacrifice he made for us? Do we consider how important it is when we come to worship? When we go to that altar? When we offer the sacrifice of praise? When we offer the sacrifice of self? Because, we too have our type. This morning we sang the song, I Gave My Life for Thee. My dad used to always sing that song when he led singing before the Lord's Supper. And when I was younger, I didn't catch what that song meant. I couldn't figure out what it was because I was thinking of it as myself, right? But the song is sung as God would be singing, as Christ is singing to us. I gave my life for thee. What have I given to me? I've done all this for you. What are you doing for me? Because there was a sacrifice made that God gave his life for us. But we ourselves are also following in that sacrifice. In Romans chapter 6 and verses 3 through 6, it tells us that we had a type. It says, do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. The death and burial and resurrection of Jesus, that act is replayed in our own lives when we die to sin. When we're buried in baptism, we're raised to a newness of life. We are following in that foreshadowing, that example, that type. Why? That our old body was crucified with him in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we be no longer slaves to sin. As Abraham was a type for God, for Christ, the sacrifice that was being made was an example. So we too are to exemplify what Christ has done for us. But when it comes to our death, we're not so sure. It reminds me of the line from some story where the guy said to the crowd, are you willing to die for me? Are you willing to die today in this battle? And somebody said, yeah, just a little bit. We just want to die a little bit, right? Not all the way, not complete commitment, just a little bit. But he said we must die to what? It all. So that body of sin might be done away with. See, God's asking us to do what he asked Abraham to do. To lay it all on the altar. To give up self in order to do something greater. He's asking us to put our mind and our heart to him. He's asking us to step up to the test and prove ourselves fully. It's interesting because when God asked Abraham to give his son, it says his only son. And some people will argue, well, Abraham had more than one son. Now, he only had one son of the promise, Isaac, but he had Ishmael, right? He had another son. We think about God, and God has sons, but his only son, the only son that he gave. But Abraham has more than just Isaac and those descendants of Isaac. The Bible tells us that we are all sons of Abraham through faith in Christ Jesus. Galatians chapter 3:7 says, to be sure that those who are of faith, who are the sons of Abraham. You see, we're a son of Abraham when we follow in the faith of Abraham. Abraham who was willing to lay it all on the altar. Why? Because that's what his God told him he needed to do. To consider who God is and what he can do. It's funny how people will argue with God, right? When God says, this is what I want you to do to be saved. When God gives us a plan of salvation, there'll be some people that say, well, I think it should be this way, or I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's a part of it. When God tells us how to worship and how to live, we'll claim, well, I don't want all of that. I want to give all that up. But if we're truly to be sons of Abraham, if we're truly to be a follower of the Son of God, we must do what he tells us to do. We must believe in the one he sent. We must turn from the sin that brought the necessity of the sacrifice in the first place. We must make that good confession. But a confession that's not just said with words, but with works. It's lived, it's shown. We must follow in the type that was given to us. To die, to be buried, to be raised again. You see, God gave Jesus as a sacrifice so that we could follow in that example and give ourselves as a living sacrifice. But just as God gave back Abraham his son, who spared him and revealed the promise, he can do that for us. It's the sin that will destroy us, but it's the Son that will save us. Be a child of Abraham. Live in faith. Walk in faith. A faith that works. A faith that shows and is proven. A faith that follows in the example set before us. Tonight, if you're subject to the invitation, tonight, if you need to put Christ on in baptism, tonight, if you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters, we don't want this day to pass without that need being held. So if you need to respond to the gospel invitation, we invite you to come right now while we stand and sing.